Noah, you're here, so thank you so much for being part of Archivio Aperto this year, for taking your time to come and see us in Bologna. And you're competing with Navigators. Is it your first film?
Yes.
Yes, it is your first. Perfect. So I want to ask you a little bit. I've also mentioned this on the email. You know that this year's theme is The Future is Memory. So I'd really like to know, from your point of view of filmmaker, how do you relate to the theme, and like what do you think of it, and like what type of meaning do you give to it? Like how does it resonate with you, this idea of The Future is Memory?
So Navigators is very much a historical film. I mean, it's really focused on a particular historical moment, and I don't make any parallels with current day issues, but I think anyone watching the film is inevitably going to be thinking about both the present and I hope also the future, and even if it is a film that is in many ways tragic and really about a very difficult political moment in a lot of ways. One of the things that really inspired me to make this film was reading the accounts of the deportation by Emma Goldman, by Alexander Berkman, and it was really this sense of hope as well. And so I think that's also a way, perhaps, that the film, all while thinking about the past, working with materials from the past, can also point towards the future.
Do you think that there is already some hope, like there is some inherent hope that you find in these archives, or do we create the hope afterwards while we reuse these materials from the past? How do you think that happens there?
I think it's really present in the text that I'm reworking. So these letters and different accounts of the deportation written by Alexander Berkman, by Emma Goldman, so they were forcibly exiled from the United States to Soviet Russia, and they both of them and many of the other deportees who were on the Buford, who were deported on the Buford, were anarchists, but many of them did see a lot of hope with the Bolshevik Revolution, so they were kind of somewhat, there was different points of view, in terms of the deportees on the ship, but it's true that Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, despite the fact that it was, the Bolshevik Revolution was very much a statist revolution, a revolution, that really strengthened the state, which is quite contradictory. For anarchists, they saw a lot of hope in this country that they had left when they were both very young, and finally that was freed from Tsarism. So there was kind of this sense of hope of reaching this country, even if they were, exiled once again by force and not by choice, of going to the, finding Russia now, in this revolutionary Russia. And the film also tells the story of what happened to them and what happened to the anarchists in Russia after as well. But it's true that I think that's something that really kind of inspired me while making this film, was that, even if it is a very tragic story, that really is this sense of hope that is present already in the text, in these accounts, and I think is also, to me, something that I find is also a characteristic of anarchism, or at least certain anarchist writers, and their relation to history.
That's beautiful. But how do you see yourself in all of this web of hope and action and engagement, political engagement, etc., or world making or border making? Like, how do you see your role as a filmmaker in transmitting somehow this hope from the past and communicating it to the present, and also maybe hopefully to the future?
So the film really does adopt the point of view of the anarchists. It doesn't try to provide, the deportees. It doesn't try to really provide like a, let's say, a balanced account. I mean, there are, all of the historical sources, they're present in the film, but I wouldn't say that my goal was to, give an impartial account. Even there's certain events that are told by the deportees that sometimes you could wonder, we have government reports, etc., that perhaps we could nuance these accounts, or perhaps we could, provide a more complex portrait. But I really wanted to tell the film from the point of view of the anarchists, of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, and I do identify with them and with their ideas, and that's something that I wanted to transmit in the film. And I also think that I live in France now, I don't live in the United States anymore, but looking at my home country from afar, I have the impression that things are changing, in terms of kind of radical left movements, and even the term socialism, which in Europe is not a big deal, but in the United States was like, is extremely taboo term, not to mention, anarchism or communism or anarcho-communism. And so I think that was also something that perhaps inspired me to make this film, and I hope that it can be relevant in that way, because I feel like there is something that's changing right now in the United States. Once again, I'm kind of observing it from afar. But I think that, especially among young people, that there is, the mentalities are changing in relation to these ideas, to the ideas of the radical left.
It took 15 years for you to adopt the point of view of the French, like to fully integrate in the society and become one, and like try to bring the revolution to the streets. And how do you see archives? Like, do you feel like working again with archives maybe in the near future? I don't know if you want to work again with films in general, because I don't know. Depends on you. But do you feel like working also with the archives in the future? Like, do you see it as a good source of work? Like, I don't know, what way work method whatsoever. And if you do, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that working with archives, working with pre-existing materials in general is really kind of at the core of my work. I mean, who knows in 10 years if I'll be wanting to make completely different work, but I mean, right now it's true that that's something that is really that really interests me. Even if I also I'm currently working on a new project where perhaps I might work with it's very much based around archives as well, but perhaps I'll be working with actors in forms of kind of reenactment and stuff as well. But in the experience, I would say, of working with Navigators as well, it's just there's so much out there, and there's so much out there that you can explore in so many different ways. And also watching the films at the festival, since I've been here as well, it's so inspiring to see the way different filmmakers work with archives.
Okay, so if that's perfect, because if it remains a source of inspiration, my follow-up question that I was trying to ask is how do you see archives or film archives in the context? It's mostly institutional archives as well, right? It's not personal archives or private archives. The one that you're working with.
I was working with a lot of different types of archives. A lot of the film prints that I was working with were prints that I collected myself. So really collecting was a really important part of the film. So I collected film prints, mostly slapstick, the Navigator, so a 16mm print of Buster Keaton's The Navigator was a really important source of material, but also other slapstick films, other Keaton films that I collected on Super 8, or mainly 16mm and a few Super 8 prints as well. And then I also collected different printed materials from the era. So, for example, first edition books of the work of Emma Goldman, of Alexander Berkman, in which they talk about the deportation, or also other of their works, and postcards of the Buford, the ship that is, that they were deported on. I collected 70 RPM records that were also used to make the film's soundtrack that didn't in most cases have a direct connection to the subject, but were released in 1919, 1920, this period of the first Red Scare in the United States. So collecting was a really important part of the film. So on one hand, there's this kind of personal collection, but also the institutional archives that I worked with. And in most cases, the institutional archives that I worked with, I didn't have the kind of the physical materials. I was with the objects that I collected. I was reworking them, on the rostrum camera at L'Abominable, which is an artist-run film lab. So I was kind of this overhead camera that I used to film these documents in color, or using the optical printer to refilm the prints that I collected. But then the archives that were coming from institutional archives, I was mostly working with reproductions, and in that case, I still transferred them to film. It was kind of important for me to have this homogeneity of the materials. And so I either printed them out and then filmed them on the rostrum camera, or in some cases I filmed a screen with 16mm. And in that case, I used black and white film stock. So the materials from my collection, at least in terms of the printed materials, I used color film stock, and then I used black and white film stock to film the archives from institutional sources. And it was important for me to kind of create that distinction, even if it's not, there's a lot of things that are specified with kind of footnotes in the film and stuff, but that's not something that is explicitly specified in the film. But it was important for me to have a kind of a trace of where these, the materiality of the documents and where they were coming from.
I'm so glad that I asked this question, because I love I love that there is also, like, in addition to working with institutional archives, that there's this element of like cherry picking a little bit, or like working very closely with the material. And I actually want to ask you, I've asked this question in three steps, but like how is the nature of this work? Because like I'm guessing, yeah, like I think there's a different, because I've also talked with other directors, and I guess there's a different aspect. I mean, there's a different work method when you are going to an institutional archive and like maybe waiting in line, or like having to establish relationships and like making convincing that okay, this is what you're doing, this is your work, you're credible person, like, you know, like that they can trust, etc. But how was your work with the material that you were handpicking? How was the relationship that you had with it? And I'm also wondering, like, how did it stand? Like, how did you see this physical connection, also related to the political engagement that you were trying to make out of it? If I can already assume that it was the case, I don't know if you can say something about it.
Yeah, it was really important to me to be able to kind of touch these materials and, you know, this kind of, you know, physical relationship to them. So I was collecting, you know, different printed materials that most of them I bought on eBay, or that I would have like different alerts on eBay looking for specific documents or newspapers from the era, that some of them took me several years to find. Some of them I even found after I finished the film, but I couldn't help but, you know, kind of sort of completing the collection in a way. And so that really kind of depended on what was available, and sometimes I would first find certain materials in more institutional archives, or that, you know, were in the public domain but were available online, but I wanted to find a physical copy of a book, for example. And in some cases I was able to, in some cases I wasn't, but I didn't want to limit myself either to what, you know, I could kind of physically be holding in my hands. And then actually the institutional archives that I worked with, in many cases, I was really working with the digital platforms. So the film kind of has this, you know, sort of, it was all made on film, so you might, you know, see, you know, this kind of, you might see the film as a sort of purist approach, but in reality I was working both in the post-production as well, where there's kind of a lot of back and forth between analog and digital, but also in the research process. I was working with a lot of, for example, the Library of Congress has an archive, a platform called Chronicling America with American newspapers. I was also working with the materials, the archives of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, which are conserved in Amsterdam at the International Institute for Social History. And all of these materials were either, you know, first microfilmed and then scanned, or scanned. So there's also kind of these, you know, transfers as well that are quite interesting, and that also have aesthetic effects. You know, it's not the materials, you know, visually are quite different if it's, you know, a scan, you know, of a newspaper, if the newspaper was first microfilmed and then scanned, etc. And so that was also something that interested me when I was working with the materials. I actually didn't do a lot of research in physical archives, because, you know, I had so much material available online, or also there's this project, the Emma Goldman Papers, which is kind of a meta archive. Actually, they made I think it's like 90 microfilm reels where they bring together all the materials that were related to Emma Goldman, you know, letters, etc., that then were collected on microfilm. And I believe it was in, if I'm not mistaken, in 1990 that there was like 60 microfilm reels, or I can't remember the exact number, and they're all available now on archive, on the Internet Archive. And so they're available for anyone to go and see and to discover. And there's also been books that have been published, especially for the American years of Emma Goldman, based on all of these materials. So there was, you know, really this abundancy of materials, and even I was working with archives of the Bureau of Investigation, which is the kind of the ancestor of the FBI. And in that case, you know, these documents were microfilmed. Unfortunately, from what I understand, the original archives were actually destroyed after they were microfilmed. But I was also, you know, able to have access to those materials. And so really the only physical archive that I was really going, you know, you know, consulting the materials on site was, so there's part of the film, you know, it's mostly, you know, reworking pre-existing materials, but there's some footage that we shot in Finland and in Russia, where the deportees landed. They landed in Finland and then were transferred by train into the Russian border. In the National Archives of Finland, they have a series of photographs that were taken during this, when the Finnish military, the Finnish military officer who was in charge of conducting the deportees to the border was also an amateur photographer. So there's these kind of photo albums and different also materials, archival materials, from related to this couple of days in which they were going from where they landed in Finland to the Russian border, and we were able to film those materials on both 16 and 35 millimeter film, and so it's also great sometimes you work with these institutions, and we had just planned to go and to consult the archives with my cinematographer, and who is Finnish, Ville Pipo, and so he really helped me out also with translating documents from Finnish, and it was this part of the project he was a really important collaborator, both shooting on film, because I did all the lab work, but then the materials, the footage that we shot in Finland and in Russia, and the archives that we shot, he was shooting them, and we weren't necessarily planning on shooting the archives, and we just asked them, we have a 35 millimeter camera and a 60 millimeter camera, can we film these archives? And they said, sure. So sometimes, you hear a lot of stories of how difficult it can be with rights, etc. And I have a few, examples of that with Navigators that I won't go into, but it's true in general. Sometimes it's just, you have people that are, archivists that are really happy to share these materials, or with Library and Archives Canada, who they sent us, 35 millimeter safety prints that I was able to rework on the optical printer. We just paid for the shipping. They didn't even ask us to pay for these. The images, they're in the public domain, but that doesn't stop sometimes certain private archives from charging you. So there's also a lot of examples of actually, working with either being there on site or collaborating with other archives, in which things went really smoothly. So that was really great.
Okay, I am so happy about this conversation, but I'm also realizing that this is going towards the direction that the research I'm doing right now on archives. So I am going to wrap it up for home movies, and I'm going to thank you again for being part of Archivio Aperto, and good luck also with your film in the official competition. So I'm going to stop this here.